This is someone who put their reputation out to, I am here to help animals and I am here to help you help animals. And yet the opposite was occurring.
He was a world-renowned zoologist who spent years appearing on major networks like BBC and National Geographic. But that reputation was tarnished when shocking allegations of abuse and murder were revealed.
Who would not feel confident in giving a zoologist who spends his life and career in trying allegedly to help animals? You think those people would feel super comfortable giving those animals away, yet they're victims of fraud that led to violence.
Dozens of animals sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered, all at the hands of scientist Adam Britton, who went so far as to have a torture room inside his home. The chilling acts of abuse only came to a stop when Britton accidentally outed himself by recording the horrific acts.
And it's really amazing to me that people think that way and think that that's somehow going to help them when they're basically solidifying the proofs that the government need against you.
While there's been recent developments in the case, Britton's abuse apparently dates back decades. Britton grew up in the United Kingdom and would go on to receive both a Bachelor's of Science and his PhD in zoology. But ahead of all that, Britton said he developed a sexual fascination with animals and began molesting horses at age 13. Britton called himself sadistic as a child to animals, but says he repressed that urge for years. During that time, he gained notoriety as a crocodile expert and moved to Australia to pursue that career. Over the next few decades, he appeared on BBC, National Geographic, Discovery Channel, and Animal Planet, all as a foremost expert in the world of crocodiles. But things changed in 2014 when Britton apparently went back to his old ways. Detectives investigating Britton's case found a message he wrote in a chat room reading, quote, "In the last few years, I let it out again, and now I can't stop. I don't want to." He ended that message with a smiley face. Over the course of the next 8 years, Britton perfected his disturbing crime, first coercing people to hand over their dogs, then sexually abusing and physically torturing the animals, sometimes until their death. According to Australian prosecutors, Britton sexually abused at least 42 dogs. 39 of them died. Britton admitted that he abused his own pets, but on a less severe scale. According to investigators, Britton wrote, quote, "My own dogs are family, and I have limits. I only badly mistreat other dogs. I have no emotional bond to them. They are toys, pure and simple, and there are plenty more where they came from." In order to obtain these dogs, Britton used the website Gumtree Australia, similar to Facebook Marketplace. He found people looking to give away their pets and promised to rehome the dogs, telling their owners they would thrive on his vast Australian property. Instead, many of the dogs were murdered, and Britton used their torture as examples of how to coach other like-minded people on how to abuse animals and get away with it. But all that came to a crashing halt when Britton left an identifying leash in the background of one of his videos.
This is a very unique thing we're speaking about here. It's something I've never encountered as a prosecutor or as a criminal defense attorney. I've had issues with animals, but not where the animals were basically the target of the whole investigation. And it was someone who's responsible. This isn't like someone who was drunk and got mad at their neighbors and kicked their dog or something of that nature. This is someone who put their reputation out to, I am here to help animals and I am here to help you help animals. And yet the opposite was occurring, and he was getting paid for it.
That's Mike Corbanix, a criminal defense attorney and former assistant prosecutor. He says the case is problematic on many levels.
This is really an abuse of trust, because as a zoologist, he's supposed to be there to make sure that basically animals, we learn more about them and how they adjust to our environment and things of that nature. Now, someone in that protective employment who then is posting on, I don't know if it was Instagram or however, but sharing photos of abusing animals is really something that is basically in the United States would be considered an official misconduct, because you are taking what you're being paid for and trusted for and doing the exact opposite of what you're supposed to be doing to protect the animals.
Britton was arrested in September 2022 and ultimately faced 56 charges relating to bestiality and animal cruelty. For 1 year, Britton's name was kept quiet under a suppression order, but when he pleaded guilty in September 2023, his name became public. After several delays in a sentencing hearing, a punishment was finally handed down to Britton just this month. At the hearing, the case's justice told Britton that his, quote, depravity falls entirely outside any ordinary human conception. But that's not all he said. What really jumped out to me about this case is that when they were going through court proceedings, the judge actually made an announcement and said, anyone in the courtroom, this is a really grotesque case. You may suffer from nervous shock, so beware, this is pretty severe. And people actually, according to BBC, ran out of the courtroom. Some people were crying. That really struck me as something different. Is that something you've ever heard before, a judge warning people that the case is going to be this intense?
I don't think it's something that is off the charts for a judge to do. I think he was speaking generally to the public and not specifically to a jury. But either way, the person still in Australia carries a presumption of innocence, just like our country. But I think it's a judge's duty to inform people that these are the things they may be viewing and to assure that they'll be able to be not judgmental, but non-prejudiced just on the facts, because you still have to, whatever these photos show, you have to prove that he had something to do with it. So I think it's a safe question because that will keep people more neutral, because if someone is a heavy animal advocate, they may be prejudicial, just saying, I don't care if this guy's even associated with it, I'm going to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
And you're talking about the photos or videos that he recorded, which leads me to my next question. If he's committing these acts of violence that are illegal both here in the United States and in Australia, why would he record himself and thus implicate himself in these crimes?
That's an interesting question. And I may be too old to answer that question, seeing I didn't grow up with a cell phone. Cell phones came on as I was a lawyer, they became more and more frequently used. And quite frankly, it has changed, in my opinion, the way that cases are handled now, because it is sometimes shocking to see what people do in illegal activities and then post them on Instagram or on websites and things of that nature, or text between one another, when that becomes evidence that could always be found. And it's really amazing to me that people think that way and think that that's somehow going to help them, when they're basically solidifying the proofs that the government need against you. So I don't understand that, but it is very common.
By recording videos and photos of the abuse, Corbonic says that Britton gave Australian prosecutors a pretty strong case, but he did more than just record videos. Investigators also found, in addition to these videos and photos, messages that he was making in chat rooms where he admitted to years of having an interest in this sort of activity, shall we say, that he was admitting to having sexually assaulted or tortured animals since he was a child. So he has it just written right there in black and white. Again, that's kind of incriminating himself, right?
That's absolutely incriminating himself. It's a statement against interest. It's not something that was said to the police, where then you may have some constitutional protections. I don't know the Constitution in Australia, but things of that nature. But these are open to the general public. And those are very difficult for a defense attorney to deal with when you have that has been disclosed to other people.
Through the chat room conversations, investigators learned about Britton's recent illegal activity, but also his backstory. And if we're talking about his history of abuse, he said that when he was a kid, around age 13, he started sexually assaulting horses. And then he apparently suppressed this urge, if we're going to call it that, and then started again around 2014, abusing these animals and kind of getting back into it until he was arrested in 2022. So as investigators are going through all of this information that they're collecting, would they look back on his history and prior tendencies, I guess, to indulge in this type of activity?
Well, I think they're going to have to. I think they're under an obligation for many reasons. I don't know exactly who he was hired for, but as a zoologist, he would then have to be investigated just for whether it was the government or a private company. He had responsibilities, and you have to check on the ethical obligations he had within those standards of whatever company or government he was working for. So it's a complicated case, and it's something that's going to take a lot of investigation.
Investigators say Britton used an encrypted social media service called Telegram to find a community of other abusers. Talking about other people, because we know that he communicated with them via chat room where he's kind of talking about his sadistic history, and then he's sharing these photos and videos. Would investigators then go back and look at the other usernames that he was talking to, other people who may have posted photos or videos, and potentially charge them with related crimes?
That could very well happen. That could very well happen. Especially, you made a good point by saying, were they sharing what they were doing as well? Was this a common position to be on the computer and everybody who had the same interest of abusing animals?
Britton's downfall came from an anonymous tip after he left an identifying object in one of his posts. The video showed Britton abusing 7 puppies and an adult dog, but he'd forgotten to remove a bright orange leash that read City of Darwin, the same place that Britton lived. And the way that he eventually was caught was because there was this leash, I guess, in the background of one of his videos that had the name of the city that he lived in. So it was a pretty identifying factor. But ahead of this, I mean, he was making videos, these photos for years, and apparently would go through and blur things out that may have been identifying. So in the past, things that could have alerted people to who was the one making the video, he did the best he could to kind of assuage that, make sure that no one could find him. Does that lead to intent that he knows that this is a crime, that he's trying to cover something up?
Yes, absolutely. But it still has that question that I just find very amazing, that people are doing things like that and posting it and thinking that that is going to stop them from being investigated, because eventually someone's going to figure out who's who. And quite frankly, when people exchange on the internet and things of that nature, when I say Instagram, I mean that generally. I don't mean specifically that he used Instagram, because I don't know what he used, but people would be aware of it, and you're going to be exposed sooner or later. It would be interesting to know. I mean, in addition to what you just pointed out, how law enforcement saw that leash and things of that nature, I am sure there were other people they interviewed to come and validate who he was.
Does it make things more intense because of the dozens of animals that were abused here? I mean, he had his own personal animals that he allegedly did abuse, but then would seek out other animals on Marketplace, people who were hoping to rehome their personal pets. He would then seek them out, and then he would take these dogs and abuse them. So that's kind of showing he's going out of his way to find these animals. And then there's almost 50 that he was assaulting. Does that make things a little bit more severe?
Absolutely, because it's also, once again, a misrepresentation. And it shows, when you have a misrepresentation, in my opinion, it always helps the prosecution show that there was intent, because you knew what you were doing was wrong. It's not like he could say, oh, I wanted to get this dog because he was losing his home and I wanted to help him, but the dog then lost whatever behavior it was and I lost it and I killed the dog. That doesn't seem to be like what the defense was here. It was like, I was looking to kill animals. When I saw a dog, I got it because I knew I could kill it. And there's no, like, it's just very difficult, especially with that kind of background, because who would not feel confident in giving a zoologist who spends his life and career in trying allegedly to help animals? You think those people would feel super comfortable giving those animals away, yet they're victims of fraud that led to violence.
While Britton did ultimately plead guilty to the crimes, his representation still came up with some sort of explanation for why he committed the crimes in the first place. His defense came forward with something interesting. They said that he had a rare disorder that caused an intense, atypical interest in animals. It's an unusual defense, at least to me. What would you make of that?
That would be a defense where I'd really like to see what the psychiatrist says and how they come to that conclusion, because it is something, though, that I don't know how it could help the defense, in as much as showing then that he was aware of a mental disorder, he got no help for it, yet he maintained a job that allowed him to abuse animals. So it really builds up more intent and less of a situation where he could really say, I had a psychological problem, because if you were aware of that problem and you did nothing to help it, it's not a case where someone did all this and then they're evaluated later and find that they had a psychological problem that they weren't aware of. So I don't see how that really could help him.
But the bestiality and abuse charges weren't the only ones Britton faced. And we've talked a lot about these severe crimes. I mean, torture, murder, sexual assault, but also when investigators came to his home and looked through his things, they found child abuse material. So videos or photos, I'm not exactly sure what it was, but children that he has recorded too. Does that bring things to another level here, that not only was it dogs and animals that he was abusing, but he also had this material involving children?
Well, that's very interesting, because when I saw that, that really perked my mind up and saying, are they investigating before did they conclude that investigation before they charge him with the animal abuse to see if he did abuse children? We don't know where it's at. It could be that they're still investigating that to see where it's going to go. Usually, though, I would think they would have tried to resolve everything in one way, saying, not only do we have this with animals, now you're going to risk children, which is huge difference as far as penalties and the amount of prison time. So I would believe they're still investigating it, or maybe they did investigate it and they found nothing.
Corbonic says now that Britton's crimes have come to light, it's likely his past employers will take a closer look at his work history. If we're talking about where he worked, he was kind of all over the place, but there were some pretty big name companies like BBC and National Geographic that he actually had his name attached to. So does that mean what you're saying, that either BBC, National Geographic would kind of go back in their files, maybe investigate and look over their work with him?
Absolutely. And this is something difficult too for the employment, because it appears, because of who he was hired by, he had a substantial reputation. However, what would really need to be further looked into is, who was he sharing these statements with? Was it like a group on a computer that shared an animal abuse, something that was like off record, sort of off pace? That would be very interesting to see who he was communicating with and why he was communicating that way. Also, it'd be interesting to see what his psychological evaluations are in preparation for this case. Was this something he knew was wrong? Obviously, he knew it was wrong, but was he actually just trying to rescue himself and animals by saying, I'm doing something wrong, I need help?
We've talked about how this guy was a zoologist. He was obviously very well respected in the fact that he worked with BBC, National Geographic. These are major companies that we all know of and have likely watched at some point in our lives. Would you say that these crimes that he's now been convicted of, he has been sentenced to time for, have ruined his reputation, that it's completely tarnished his future in zoology?
I would believe so. I mean, it's, first of all, he's got an indicted conviction, so he's got that to start with. But I don't think anyone would want to hire him, because if they did hire him and this occurred again, they would be probably civilly liable, because they were on notice and yet this still occurred. So I think this would end his career. And I'm not really sure if, as a zoologist, you actually need a license. So if he has a license and it's required, usually licenses are not given to people with criminal convictions.
Meanwhile, investigators could also look into Britton's past to see if any other crimes come to light. Just having a background in true crime and covering a lot of these stories, we hear patterns for serial killers or people who are interested, let's say, in murder. Oftentimes, or at least sometimes, they have a history of when they're children violating animals, torturing them or killing them, and then it eventually leads to other things that are more severe. So here we for sure have that this man's been convicted of harming animals. Do you think it's possible then that investigators would go back into his background and look if he's ever assaulted or harmed a human?
I'm sure they look through his background when they're doing their investigation and interviewing people and see who they come across. I don't really understand how someone could use that position to not only do this once or twice, but to continually do it and be totally aware of it being wrong shows such a sense of evil intent and arrogance, quite frankly, that the investigation, I think they're going to look at rather deeply to see where else things have occurred.
The nature of Britton's crimes, while severe, means that his overall prison sentence will be lesser than the defendants we usually talk about. Now, this is a disturbing case because of what it entails. I mean, dozens of animals who've been tortured to death, sexual assault. These are pretty severe things, but what we cover here on Law and Crime is usually of the human variety, not as much animals. So this is pretty disturbing and it's immoral, but it's definitely different, at least legally, compared to murdering or sexually assaulting a human. So can you describe that for me a bit, the difference between these acts against an animal versus a human?
Well, it's basically the same actions that are taken. It's just where that community in writing their laws decide the penalties are. I'm not familiar if these penalties in Australia are something that stays or correlates with murder as a human being. But it usually with animals, it is in my recollection is that it's a lesser penalty. However, it's still I mean, he's getting substantial time as a result of this.
If we're talking about that, the amount of time that he is sentenced to, 10 years behind bars, plus what he's already been serving, do you think that amount of time is justice served?
That's a little difficult for me because I don't really know where the Australian maximum sentence is on this, but 10 years is a significant time, and usually the penalties are not for animals as they are for human beings. So that's something that needs to be looked in a little bit, but 10 years is a long period of time. However, this also too shows there's questions too. Was he committing a fraud? Because he was, as a zoologist, you're basically implying that you're there to work for whatever company or government hires you to make it a safer place for animals. Yet you were a person contributing to making it unsafe for animals while you're getting paid from the government or whoever the private company is.
Britton was ultimately sentenced to 10 years and 5 months in Australian prison. He will be eligible for parole in September of 2028. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Gillespie.